Blessed be the reading of your word, Heavenly Father. We're on Genesis chapter 19. Let's eat. And there came two angels to Sodom at even, and Lot sat in the gate of Sodom. And Lot, seeing them, rose up to meet them, and he bowed himself with his face toward the ground. So now remember, when Abraham was talking to these angels, it was three of them, right? And then those angels kept going, and Abraham stood still there with the Most High. So then now two angels come to Sodom. So one of those three people that Abraham saw had to be, must have been the Most High or the Most High's representative, Christ or whatever. You understand? So now it's two angels, because remember back in, let me just show you that. So in chapter 18, verse 2, it said, this is where Abraham is sitting at the door of his tent. And it says, and he lifted up his eyes and looked, and lo, three men stood by him. And when he saw them, he ran to meet them. So now, then, they had their little talk. Then the angels, they went on towards Sodom and Gomorrah. But in verse 22 in chapter 18, it said, the men turned their faces from there and went towards Sodom, but Abraham stood yet before the Lord. So now we see in verse 1 in chapter 19, two angels came to Sodom at evening, right? So, well, so it didn't say angels. It didn't say angels, but as you look into the book further, angels tend to show up and look like men, right? So, and if you read through chapter 18, like it said, three men, verse 2 in chapter 18, it says, three men stood by him, and when he saw them, he ran to meet them from the tent door and bowed himself toward the ground. So typically, a lot of times, unless these people are like a king or somebody, you wouldn't typically bow to them, you know what I'm saying? And then he also said, then he addressed him and said, my Lord, if now I have found favor in your sight, pass not away. So he's giving him a certain level of respect by calling him my Lord, right? And then if we go through and we read 18, he was able to read Sarah's mind. Because remember, he said, verse 9, chapter 18, verse 9, and they said unto him, where is Sarah your wife? And he said, behold, in the tent. And he said, I will certainly return unto you according to the time of life. And lo, Sarah your wife shall have a son. And Sarah heard it in the tent door, which was behind him. Now, Abram and Sarah were old, so Sarah heard it, right? And then, and so we know this is because if we go back to chapter 17, when he was talking to God, if we go back to chapter, so you got to take this thing in this whole context. So you got a biblical context, you got a chapter, you got a context of a book, and you got a context of a chapter, and you got a context of an individual verse. So if you put all this together, we go back to chapter 17. It said, remember, because the Most High promised, 17 was the chapter where God made the covenant with Abraham, right? So that was God talking to Abraham, you remember? In verse 19 in chapter 17, it says, chapter 17, verse 19, it literally said, God said, Sarah your wife shall bear you a son indeed, and you shall call his name Isaac, and I will establish my covenant with him for an everlasting covenant, and with his seed after him. And then he goes on to say, but I heard what you said about Ishmael, and I'm going to bless him. He's going to be a mighty nation. 12 princes are going to come from him. Then verse 21, God is saying to Abraham, but my covenant will I establish with Isaac, which Sarah shall bear unto you at this set time in the next year. So then when we get to the chapter 18, where it says three men showed up, you know what I mean? And then he goes on to talk about, like, he says in verse 11, now Abraham and Sarah were old and well stricken in age. Verse 10. Then, so it's three men, right? In chapter 18, if we get to verse 10 in chapter 18, he said, and he said, I will certainly return unto you according to the time of life. And lo, Sarah your wife shall have a son. And Sarah heard. So he's repeating what he already told him back in a year earlier, back in chapter 17. That's also letting us know that this is some angels. This is God talking to him. You follow? So he told him that he was going to give him a son named Isaac in chapter 17. He said at this set time next year. So now he then came back again in chapter 18, and he's saying to him, because in chapter 17, verse 19, he said, it says, God said, Sarah, your wife, shall bear you a son indeed. So that's God talking to him. And then in verse 22 in chapter 17, it says, and he left off talking with him, and God went up from Abraham. Now we get over to chapter 18, he sees three what they call men. And then verse 10 in chapter 18, he says, and he said, it didn't say God said this time. It just says, and he said, I will certainly return unto you according to the time of life. And lo, Sarah your wife shall have a son. And Sarah heard it in the tent door, which was behind him. Then it keeps going. Verse 12 says, therefore Sarah laughed within herself, saying, after I am waxed old, shall I have pleasure, my Lord being old also? My Lord meaning my husband. And then listen what it says in verse 13. And here it says, and the Lord said unto Abraham. So there it is. The Lord said to Abraham, wherefore did Sarah laugh, saying, shall I of a surety bear a child which am old? So that's identifying who's talking to him right there. So one of those three men is the Lord in verse 13. And then it says, verse 14 says, is anything too hard for the Lord? At the time appointed, I will return unto you according to the time of life. And Sarah, I'm basically meaning I'm going to make your body younger again. And Sarah, your son Sarah shall have a son. Then Sarah denied, saying, I laughed not, for she was afraid. And he said, nay, or no, but you did laugh. But the verse said, Sarah laughed within herself. So he was able to read her thoughts. So we know this ain't just a normal man. She didn't laugh out loud. She was kind of thinking in her own mind, huh, am I getting ready to have a baby as old as I am? That type of. Right. And he read her thoughts. He was like, yeah, you did laugh. And then at 16 said, now that was saying 13, and we in chapter 18, verse 13 said, the Lord said unto Abraham. And then he said, verse 14, he said, is anything too hard for the Lord? He's talking, but he's talking in third person. But that also could be Christ saying, talking on behalf of the Most High. And he said, at the time appointed, I will return unto you according to the time of life, and Sarah shall have a son. Then Sarah denied, saying, I laughed not. And then in 16 said, and the men rose up from there and looked towards Sodom. So then it says, verse 17, and the Lord said, shall I hide from Abraham the thing which I do? So he's there talking to the Most High and these other two men, but they're angels. And we know they're angels because by the time we get to chapter, now the men they headed towards Sodom at the end of chapter 18, because then that's when he ran down, he was saying, well, if there's 50 men there, will you destroy it? The two other what they call men, the two other what they call men already left and headed towards Sodom and Gomorrah, because verse 22 said that, but Abram stood yet before the Lord. He was still standing there before the Lord, but the other men had already started walking towards Sodom and Gomorrah. And that's when Abraham went through, well, if there's 50 righteous, will you destroy it? He said no. And he worked him all the way down. Well, if it's 20 righteous, and he said no, I won't destroy it if it's 20 righteous. And then he finally got down to like, what was it, 10? And then in the very next chapter, chapter 19, verse 1, it says, and there came 2 angels to Sodom and Gomorrah, to Sodom at Eden. The book is actually letting us know that those are angels. We just got to track it through three chapters. It started in chapter 17, and then they used the word men in chapter 18, but then it also used, we saw that the Most High, the Lord, was talking to Abraham, but it used the word men in chapter 18 too. And then you know what I'm saying? So the book tells you that the angels, you just got to be able to read it. And this is important because as we move through the book, they're going to be calling angels men. You know what I'm saying? And okay, yeah. Because angels can show up and look like men. You know what I mean? They can, and they do. And that's why the book, somewhere in the book, I forget the verse, it says, careful to entertain strangers, because you never know that if you're not entertaining an angel. And a stranger will just look like me and you, and we don't know if that's an angel or not. You know what I'm saying? So there's different type of angels, and some of the angels, they can shapeshift. You know what I mean? They can look like human beings, and there's certain classes of angels that don't look like human beings. They be having three and four faces, might have wings and all kind of stuff. But we'll read all about that as we continue through the book. And that's why I like Genesis, man, because all this stuff is just about everything that we're going to read about is already in Genesis, and you'll see. And then it just lays a good foundation for us. So we chapter 19 and 1. All right, here we go.